Wir sind Talk Social Science to Me, der Podcast für Sozialwissenschaften an der Goethe-Uni in Frankfurt.
Welcome to today's episode of Talk Social Science to Me. We promised and we delivered. This is our first episode in English, so I'd like to extend a warm welcome both to our regular listeners and to our English language listeners who are unable to join us on the episodes in German. We are so excited to bring you this talk today because it's jam-packed full of so many interesting talking points. We are talking about democratic innovations and how they relate to climate change, how they relate to Brexit, how they relate to the pandemic, and all the stuff in between. It's such an exciting episode and we're so excited to have all of you listening here today. In the studio with me, Friederike, today is Dr. Rikki Dean, a researcher on democratic innovations. And before we delve into the episode, I'd like to introduce Rikki. Dr. Rikki Dean is a post-doctoral fellow at the Research Unit for Democratic Innovations at the Institute of Political Science here at Goethe. In his research, Rikki is interested in the empirical research on democracy, so he seeks to combine democratic theory and public administration theory with empirical social science to understand issues in participatory governance. Prior to joining the Institute of Political Science at Goethe, he completed his PhD at the London School of Economics on the topic of democratizing bureaucracy. He's also worked at several universities in the UK, including Birmingham, Manchester, Oxford, and Westminster. He has been a visiting fellow at the Ash Center for Democratic Innovation and Governance at Harvard University and the Université Libre in Brussels. He's just returned to Frankfurt from Brussels and is currently focusing on projects about what citizens and other political actors want democracy to look like and how citizen deliberation can be integrated into political institutions. We hope you enjoyed today's episode just as much as we enjoyed producing it. Welcome to the studio, Rikki. We're glad to have you on this episode on democratic innovations.
Hi, Friederike. It's very nice to be here.
And as usual, we start our podcast off with the very simple question, how did you become a political scientist?
Well, actually, I guess for me, it's not such a simple question. So I think that it was largely accident and then also part sort of meandering intellectual journey. So actually, my bachelor's degree is in philosophy and English literature. And I really studied that with the intention of being a novelist.
Okay.
So
that's
it's
quite
quite
different,
a change of direction.
I was going to say.
Yeah, so when I finished my bachelor's degree, I was sort of faced with the problem of how to pay my rent and feed myself.
What? That's unusual.
So I just sort of decided I couldn't really see a clear pathway to doing those things by becoming a novelist. So I was forced in some senses to revise my plan. Yeah, at that time, as I said, I'd been studying literature and philosophy, and I was very interested in political philosophy, and I thought, okay, well, why not become a political philosopher? So, as you can tell, I was not the most pragmatic 21-year-old, probably the only person...
From a novelist to political philosopher.
Yeah, probably the only person to ever decide to become a political philosopher for financial reasons. Yeah, I decided to study a master's in political philosophy, but as I said, I had this problem of how do I pay my rent and pay my bills, and so I took a job at Oxford University working for a professor called Christopher Hood, who's a very influential professor in public administration. So I was sort of studying political philosophy while working on a program on public administration. And it was basically through that process, looking at the ways that political philosophy sort of translated into the functioning of state institutions that I became slightly troubled, I guess, by how far normative theory often is from the way that institutions actually work. And it was basically through that process that I came to the idea for my PhD, which I think you already mentioned is about democratizing bureaucracy, right? But still, my PhD was not really in political science. I did my PhD in a social policy department at the London School of Economics. And what I felt I was really doing was empirical democratic theory, I would say. And this is still largely, I guess, what guides my work, is this kind of empirical orientation to questions of democratic theory. And the job in Frankfurt at Goethe University is actually the first time I've ever been based in a political science institute.
Oh, okay.
And I really came here specifically because I already knew Brigitte Geisel and Jonathan Rinner, and I knew we were interested in similar things, that we all had an interest in democratic systems theory and in democratic innovations. So again, it wasn't really necessarily determined by an interest specifically to work in political science. But I've been here now for 5 years, so I do kind of feel like a political scientist. But as I said, it was never really my intention to become one. So yeah, it was a kind of a mixture of serendipity and sort of just following my intellectual interests where they led, which kind of brought me here. So it's a very long story.
Yeah.
Sorry, you probably didn't expect such a long answer.
It's not that long. Other people have started as well with some professor they met in school or whatever. So it's absolutely fine. And I think also it's interesting because what we see with the social sciences usually is that people kind of wander about and then sometimes settle in on their subject.
Yeah.
And then just come into the profession kind of randomly, as opposed to being very determined to become a doctor, a medical doctor or a lawyer or whatever. So I feel like that's characteristic of the social science. You said empirical democratic theory is what you do. And I'm kind of confused by that in the sense that empirical and theory seems kind of like a contradiction. So I always think of democratic theories as debating the right way to conceptualize democracy and whole books being written about how democracy should be thought of and all of these things. So what exactly does an empirical democracy researcher do, and what does that look like in your work?
When I tell people I research democracy, they usually expect me to be very focused on sort of elections and party politics, which is not an unreasonable expectation, right? Like we tend to associate the idea of democracy with the idea of elections. So they usually then, their follow-up question is, who do you think is going to win the election, or when is Boris Johnson's horrible reign finally going to end? Things like this.
Yeah, that's the next question. I'm just no, it's not. Don't worry.
And they're usually quite surprised when I tell them, well, this is not really what I research, right? Like I can talk about those things as a informed commentator, but it's not really based on my research findings or research evidence. So of course there's really lots of different ways to do empirical political science on democracies, and the most socially visible of that is obviously polling about what kind of policies do people want in a democracy, what kinds of politicians do they support, and what are the kind of cleavages in those sorts of things, or for instance, how do certain policies come into being and things like that. But these are not really the questions that I'm interested in my research, right? So I'm interested in questions which are much closer to the sort of democratic theory questions that you just mentioned. So one question, for instance, is how do we conceptualize democracy? And I think how we conceptualize democracy is really related to another key question in political theory, which is essentially the question of political legitimacy, right? So this is the sort of question that Thomas Hobbes set us, which was essentially, if we're all autonomous individuals, how is it that we arrive at a political system whereby we can be coerced to do certain things that we don't want to do, and where does the legitimacy derive in order to compel us to do things? And so for me, the question of what democracy looks like is or what democracy should look like is partly an answer to that question of legitimate coercion. So at least for me, these questions of political legitimacy and how we conceptualize democracy, obviously normative ideal democratic theory plays an essential role in answering those questions. But for me, there's also a role for empirical insights in answering those questions. And we can develop theory through empirical approaches, and we can learn things about theory through doing empirical work. And so if we think, for instance, about the question of whether a democratic system should be conceived as democratic or not, then for me it's really difficult to separate that question from whether the actual political community conceives of the system as democratic, right? So when we think about the meaning of democracy, it's difficult to do that divorced from the empirics of the question for me. And then also if we think about whether a particular set of institutional arrangements are legitimate or not, whether they achieve this issue or realize this political legitimacy, then for me that can't be separated from how those institutions actually work in practice. So it's not purely an ideal question. So my research really starts more from a perspective of philosophical pragmatism. This is the idea really that democratic theory should actually help us solve real problems of democratic institution building. And that we develop new conceptualizations of democracy through engaging with those real-world problems of kind of democratic organization. What I really want to understand in my research is when political institutions are not functioning democratically, and then how can we address those problems through democratic innovation. And I also want to understand what kinds of democracy and democratic innovations do real political actors want? So what do citizens want? What do public administrators and politicians want? Whether there are tensions in those different expectations about political process and how we might be able to resolve those tensions. And I think these are key to answering those theoretical questions. So this is why I would call it empirical democratic theory.
The concept that is in the title of today's episode, but also one you just referenced now, is democratic innovations. And as I said before, you are a fellow in the Democratic Innovations Research Unit. Could you explain to us what this term exactly means and what types of so-called democratic innovations there are?
The term has a very specific definition, which I think wouldn't be obvious to someone approaching the term for the first time. So it is important to define what it means. So you might reasonably expect, for example, that changing the electoral system from a first-past-the-post system to a proportional representation system would be a democratic innovation.
I would say so.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a strange thing to think.
Yeah.
But really, actually, this is not what is intended by the term democratic innovations.
It'd be more a change, I suppose, because it's something that's been conceived of, I guess, in other systems, or?
Well, it's more the case that the concept of democratic innovations is a bit more tightly defined than that. So if we take the standard definition that Graham Smith developed in his book, which was called Democratic Innovations and has been very influential, then democratic innovations are conceived as institutions or processes for reimagining or deepening public participation in politics and policy making. So there's two important things there, right? One is that they're very much about public participation.
I was going to say, that's the one thing that stood out straight away. Yeah.
So this is what would, in one way, disqualify the changes of the electoral system from being a democratic innovation. And then the other is that they're focused specifically on processes and institutional designs. So that means if you think about different types of democratic innovation, they're usually conceived in terms of different types of institutional design for public participation. So some very prominent types are referendums. Another one would be participatory budgeting, and deliberative minipublics are also very prominently researched in this sort of field of democratic innovations. I think probably your listeners are pretty familiar with what referendums are. I'm not so sure about deliberative minipublics and participatory budgeting, which are maybe a little bit more obscure. So,
yes, I would say referendum's pretty clear to me, but what's a deliberative mini-public and what's deliberation in that context? I'm not quite sure.
There are many types of deliberative mini-publics, but they tend to have some features in common. One is that they usually randomly select citizens to participate. You would receive a letter from the government or something saying, we invite you to participate in this deliberative process, and this would be randomly sent to a whole load of people throughout Germany, and then you would have the option to participate or not. And the idea here is that you're trying to get a kind of representative population sample to come to this process. And then the other key parts is that people come together to deliberate for an extended period of time, usually at least a couple of weekends, but could be even longer. And they're provided with expert input. So you have scientific experts who come and give evidence, and people can interrogate them, and then they can use that to inform their deliberations with one another.
But what kind of questions would they deliberate on? Is it like really concrete local stuff, or could it also be something much broader?
Yeah, it's very, very varied, actually. I mean, it's usually restricted to a specific issue. So it could be quite a broad issue, though, or it could be a very narrow one. I mean, there's been a lot of climate assemblies recently, deliberative citizens' assemblies on climate change, where they try to formulate recommendations for what the public wants to reach, for instance, the goals for net zero targets and things like this. So this is a very common use of them. But sometimes they deal with very technical things like changes to the electoral system and things like that. So it's actually very varied what they deal with. But they usually are focused, like I said, on one specific issue. And these really came out of deliberative democracy, right? So this was an idea from deliberative Democrats about how we can make political institutions more deliberative. But they're actually quite contested within deliberative democratic theory as well. Some deliberative Democrats do not like minipublics.
Why?
Because I think they feel like minipublics has taken over the whole mantle of deliberative democracy, and deliberative democracy is a broader idea than just deliberative minipublics. And they're, in one way, they're quite sort of artificial setting. Some people are much more focused on the sort of Habermasian idea, right, of like the public sphere, and how do we make the public sphere more deliberative. Or they might be focused more on elite deliberation between politicians, like the kind of deliberation that should happen in a parliament or so on. So when you equate deliberative democracy just with these citizen deliberation initiatives, then you miss a lot of the story of deliberative democracy.
I mean, I suppose the first thing that comes to mind is this idea of self-selection, like who has time to spend a couple of weekends I would say someone who's got a really stressful job, I don't know, working in the care sector, who might have to work weekends, might not participate. And then this whole process of self-selection, which is just a very technical term for saying basically just the people turn up who really want to participate, which in itself doesn't really form such a representative group. But then if you force people to turn up and participate, you probably come out with like not that productive discussion. So I suppose it's a bit of a chicken or egg problem here.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a problem with the sort of self-selection bias. You can send letters to a randomly selected part of the population, but of course, then who responds is structurally biased. Yeah. I mean, usually what a deliberative mini-public would do would then stratify the random selection according to certain characteristics like age and gender and things like that, sometimes geographically, so
income,
that you... And so sometimes even attitudinal ones. So there was a citizens' assembly on Brexit, for instance.
I think now that you say it, I feel like I remember hearing about that.
Yeah, one. And they, because it was very important for the legitimacy of the process, they made sure that this actually happened after the referendum, not before the referendum, when it may have been much more useful. They felt it was very important to represent the people in the same proportions as who voted for Leave and Remain, right? Mm-hmm. So they made sure they had 52% of the participants were Leavers and 48% of the participants were Remainers. So you can also think about sort of attitudinal cleavages that are important for the issue as well. Although this is not so often done. I think it's actually very important to do that, but it's not so often done.
I wonder, do you remember why they decided to do it after the referendum? Was it like to give Brexit kind of a post-democracy facelift or something?
No, it was actually, I mean, it was a sensible process.
Sorry, post-decision facelift, not democratic facelift. There we go.
Basically, it wasn't conducted by the government, right? It was conducted by academics and civil society organisations. And it focused much more on what kind of Brexit do people want. Because obviously, a problem after the decision was that Brexit meant many different things to many different people, and there was a lot of debate around...
Well, Brexit means Brexit, according to Theresa May, but yes. But
yes, that didn't bring us very much further. I mean, obviously, this is still a problem.
Yes.
And so the idea was to sort of, ask people what did they think about these trade-offs between, for instance, prioritizing freedom of movement versus prioritizing the economic trade-offs and things like that. So it wasn't a kind of rehash of the referendum, should we stay or should we leave? It was more like, how should we leave? But I think the problem of setting one up before was really just that the referendum actually happened in a very short time period. It takes a while to develop these processes, right? Like if you have to randomly select a population sample, this is not a very easy thing to do.
Fair.
And so actually, I was quite keen to set one up before. There were other people who were also interested, but the timeline that the referendum worked on was not really conducive to that process. We just didn't have the time to do it before, unfortunately. But it would have been very useful because one of the key complaints that I heard from people who are not so political in the run-up to the referendum was they couldn't find any good source of information about, or any trusted source of information, which would inform their decision whether to vote Leave or Remain. And that's one of the things that these deliberative mini-publics can do, right? Like it's information from your fellow citizens rather than from a political party or a bureaucracy or so on. And sometimes some people will find that more trustworthy. So that's deliberative mini-publics. I didn't realize we would talk about them so long. Another one I mentioned was participatory budgeting. So participatory budgeting, again, actually comes in quite a lot of different forms as it's sort of translated around the world. It's tended to take different forms. And so what we've seen in Europe is actually relatively different, I would say, than the original participatory budgeting process, which was formed in Porto Alegre in Brazil. The central idea, right, is quite clear from the name. It's the idea that usually a local community, sometimes it's been on the state level, but mainly local level, would have some responsibility for deciding how public budgets are spent. So rather than electing people to decide how to spend public budgets, you have a direct say in where that money is spent. And the way that's usually functioned in Europe is that there's a process whereby people can propose projects or propose ideas for things they want to see in their local community. And then there's some support to turn those ideas into feasible projects. from the bureaucracy, the local bureaucracy. And then there's a process of voting from the local community as to which projects should get funded. So the most popular projects get funded, basically.
So say there's some parts of the community which would like to have a new playground as opposed to, say, I don't know, a skate park. And then there'd be deliberation about that and then a vote, which one takes precedence. This is just infrastructure, but I suppose it can get much larger than that.
Yeah, I mean, often these local processes are focused on these kinds of infrastructure projects, like you said, but that's essentially how it works. So those are some different types of democratic innovations, which I think hopefully demonstrate that they're very much focused on these different types of institutional designs, but within that institutional design framework, they're quite diverse, these processes. There's also a sense in which, as I said before, democratic innovations as a term is much more tightly defined than you might expect from the words democratic innovations. And so it's very much focused on public participation, and other forms of things that you might see as democratic innovation is not really what we would study within this field. But there's also a sense in which the term innovations is a bit misleading, right? Because referendums, for instance, I mean, are they very innovative? They've been around for a very long time, right? So the term is quite tricky, actually, to pin down. You might ask, I guess, if democratic innovations are all about participation, why don't we just call them participatory governance? Or, there are lots of times we're thinking about public participation, citizen engagement, participatory governance. Why do we not call it something like this? Which would be a good question, in my opinion. Well, I think there's two reasons maybe why the democratic innovations term is useful. One is just pragmatic. It's actually a rhetorically quite powerful term. So when you say, I do democratic innovations, people are very interested. And similarly, when you go to policymakers and say, do you want to do democratic innovations? They're like, yeah, who doesn't want to do democratic innovations? When you talk to them about participatory governance, they look very bored. I think it might have been similar, actually, when we were talking about titles for this podcast. When I suggested something about participatory governance, it was not as attractive as something about democratic innovations.
I suppose also because I'm not trying to be mean about public policymakers, but some of them might not actually be that keen on more participation from the public, right? Because it might interfere with their everyday business. And we know, especially on the meso level, everything that's bureaucracy and stuff, more participation from the public means more work and changes to very slow moving processes. Whereas democratic innovations got this sound of like, obviously there's this normative connotation that it's inherently positive if those things are innovative and great. So it's a good marketing scheme you've got going on of you with your democratic innovations, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think when you say participatory governance, definitely some people would see that as a threat, right, rather than something that they want to engage with. That's one issue, right? It's actually quite a rhetorically effective term. So we shouldn't too hastily get rid of it because it helps with impact work and things like that. But another thing I think as well is that it's quite useful to think about these institutional designs, right? Like the focus of democratic innovations on specifically institutional designs, I would say, is a narrower focus than just the concept of public participation, which can be thought of more broadly. And I've done a reasonable amount of work thinking about different conceptions of public participation. And the sort of four modes of public participation that I've developed in my typology, they don't really reference particular institutional designs very much. They're much more focused on the way that the participant is constructed, like what should the participant do, why do they participate, and the goal of participation.
You say you've constructed 4 types. Could you tell me what those are exactly?
The first one is participation as knowledge transfer. The second one is participation as collective decision-making and action. The third one is participation as choice and voice. And the fourth one is participation as judgment and oversight. And I basically say that these different forms of participation have quite different goals and quite different constructions of what it is that the public is meant to do. So, for example, imagine that I am the state and you are the public. In the sort of knowledge transfer mode, the way that I would see you is as an expert with some relevant information that I need in order to make good policy. So the objective of your participation is really to transfer your knowledge to me in order that I can make effective policy. Whereas the collective decision-making and action approach, this is a very different idea. It's the idea that you and I are kind of equal partners in the production of public value. So it's a much more sort of participatory democratic idea, right? Like we take decisions and do actions together. And the goal really here is to redistribute power away from me to you. So it's a very different form of participation. And then in the choice and voice form of participation, I would really see you as a consumer with your own individual needs and wants, that my policy is supposed to be responsive to. The aim of participation is really to hear your preferences, and to give you opportunities to exit. I don't meet your preferences. So like by making choices in a market or a quasi-market, these ideas have been very influential in sort of transforming public services so they function more like markets, right? Where you get a choice of your doctor or what hospital you go to for your operation or what school your child goes to and so on. And then in the final one, so judgment and oversight, the idea here is that as a state, I could potentially be a bad faith actor. And you are essentially the judge of that, right? So it's the idea of the citizens as judges. And so you have to watch over me to ensure that I don't abuse my power, my public power, or you have to shut me out of the decision altogether because I'm compromised as an actor in this kind of decision making. So here the goal of participation is much more to prevent corruption.
That makes sense. So that's why something like participatory spending or budgeting, can become so salient in certain instances, because it's in some societies that might pose a problem because money might disappear. But if the public is part of that process, is that like one of those examples?
That's a really good example. Yeah. I think that very much part of the agenda of developing participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre in Brazil was to try to control corruption in Brazilian institutions to some extent. Yeah, if you distribute budgets in this very transparent way, then it obviously becomes more difficult.
If something disappears, everybody knows because people were implicated in the process, right?
Yeah, and also, it controls the decision-making process to some extent, right? So you can't really bribe everyone in the community to vote in a certain way.
It might cost you more than you get out of the bribe, I suppose. So it makes sense.
So there's a number of reasons why that might be useful for controlling corruption. I think in Europe this has not been a major factor in the sort of proliferation of participatory budgeting, right? Like here it's been much more just this might be a way to interest people who don't usually participate or in getting involved in local politics.
Right.
The corruption element has been much less significant. But I think in other countries with higher levels of corruption, then it's definitely been a factor. And it has been, I think there's some empirical evidence as well which shows that it has been effective in reducing corruption in some cases. Yeah, so I guess what I was trying to get at with this kind of explanation of these different forms of participation is that this is a very different way of thinking about participatory governance to the democratic innovations element, right? Like I didn't mention anything like minipublics. We came on to participatory budgeting at the end, but this was not part of my typology of participation. It's much more focused on these sort of broad, almost ideological modes where you're thinking about the goals of participation and the ways that actors are constructed and the relationships between those actors and so on. And you could maybe use some of these democratic innovations like mini-publics in different ways. They may be used as a form of judgment or they may be used as a form of knowledge transfer. And you actually see that in practice, that they're differently constructed by public administrations sometimes. So sometimes as advisory inputs into policymaking and sometimes as breaking policy deadlocks more in a judgment role. So
you can't see it because obviously you're not in the studio, but very often when we talk about this, Rikki will say you've got the state and you've got the public and kind of make a sign of the relationship between them. And I feel as though that seems to be what much of this comes down to, is the idea that in some way the relationship between the state and the public needs to be improved in order for it to become more democratic. But that leads me to my next question, without wanting to put you all on the spot, but what makes all of you democratic innovator researchers think that we need to improve that relationship? Why the need for democratic innovations? Is democracy right now not working?
Well, I'm British, so of course I think that democracy at the moment is functioning pretty badly.
I didn't want to take you there straight away, but you went there. I didn't. All right.
So I think there are lots of problems with today's democracies. I don't think we probably have time to talk about all of democracy's problems at the moment. I think there's two big ones that sort of preoccupy me and drive my research. So the first problem is the problem of political inequality. And the essential promise of democracy is to deliver something that at least approximates political equality, and that we should all have some means to influence decisions that affect us. And it's very difficult, I think, to argue that our current representative democracies function in that way. So there are quite a few US political scientists that have been documenting for a while now just how far democratic politics in the US is captured by the wealthy. So, for example, by showing how when there's a policy dispute between the interests of the wealthy and the interests of the median voter, the policy outcome is almost always the one favoured by the wealthy. So there was a relatively recent article by Jeffrey Winters and Benjamin Page where they argued that the US system is an oligarchic democratic compromise because economic policies that affect the material interests of oligarchs are always decided in their favour. But on social issues that oligarchs don't care about, then there's still space for democratic politics. But I'm pretty skeptical of that, actually, because it's not that oligarchs are not influential on social issues, it's just that they're divided on social issues, so they balance each other out to some extent. I think there's this real problem of the influence of the wealthy on our politics. I don't think this problem is quite so deep in European democracies like Germany and the UK as it is in the US, because we at least have some constraints on election spending and other forms that the wealthy can influence democratic politics, but I still think is a relatively large problem. So there's a real question, I think, about whether we can call democracies democracies at all, or whether they should more accurately be called oligarchies. And so from my perspective, we need some institutional interventions that break the stranglehold of the wealthy on democratic politics. And then the other side of the coin of this political inequality problem is that in most advanced democracies, we see that the poorest third of the population does not really participate in politics at all. And this is a really long-standing problem in democracies, and it seems to be getting worse. For the last 20 years or so, the sort of explanation for this trend has largely been the sort of post-democracy critique, right? So this is the idea that neoliberalism has essentially reduced the scope of politics to such an extent that politics doesn't really matter because there's no real choices. So it's like the choice between Pepsi and Coke. But it really feels less and less that we're in this kind of post-democracy scenario, right? We're dealing with multiple crises at the moment. There's an economic crisis, or at least the legacy of a financial crisis, which is still having impacts. There's a health crisis, there's a huge environmental crisis, and these all have very tangible consequences on people's lives. And there are also very few electoral geographies, I would say, where the feasible voting options are limited to a choice between just the centre-left and the centre-right now. Okay, so if we take the French parliamentary election, which just took place, for example, you can't really plausibly argue that there's no meaningful choice between parties and coalitions that are led by Mélenchon, Macron and Le Pen, right? Like there's obviously very clear different policy choices there. And yet we still find turnout was a record low, less than 50% of the population turned out to vote. So there's this sort of weird paradox in commentaries on politics at the moment where we're continually told that we live in an era of polarization, but then at the same time we're told that people think all the politicians are the same and there's no point voting for them. But how can those two things both be true at the same time? I think we have to say that despite what Chantal Mouffe has called the return of the political, we don't seem to be any closer to addressing this issue of the non-participation of the most disadvantaged people in our societies. And I'd say this is probably the issue that most drove me towards thinking about democratic innovations in the first place, sort of 15 years ago or so. And that's probably actually linked to my personal history. So I grew up in a working class neighborhood, which I would say was largely apolitical. I don't really think that any of us felt like we had a voice in politics. So I was partly driven by an interest, I guess, in how people from those kinds of neighborhoods could be engaged. And I thought that democratic innovations might be a solution to this kind of problem of the lack of influence of poorer communities and people. And I would say the only time that I've really seen my family engaged in politics was the Brexit referendum. And really one of the saddest things for me about that referendum, and we sort of spoke about it a little bit earlier, was that people were really engaged and they could tell that it really mattered and they wanted to talk about it and they wanted to find out information about what the consequences of the leaving the EU would be and so on. And they were basically met with an endless barrage of lies and manipulation. And it became, for a lot of people, quite a traumatic event. Like families had to stop talking about politics, like make an agreement to stop talking about politics, as did groups of friends and so on. What was actually a real opportunity for political mobilization actually became a practice of demobilization. And I think that was partly intentional. And so for me, this was really a case study in how an unhealthy democracy does participatory politics. So it was pretty depressing.
This is the point where this podcast goes from talk social science to me to let's have a therapy session about Brexit.
Yeah, I'm definitely not good at...
Rikki looking downtrodden like this was all very depressing. And that's why I continued doing the work I do, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it was depressing for me because obviously I study partly referendums, and so I know what makes a good referendum, and I could see that this was a really terrible example of that practice. But you'll be pleased to know that I am not going to speak again about Brexit in this podcast.
No, but like, to be fair, I wonder, would you've said, I'm being provocative here, but I'm gauging from what you're saying that you would have preferred a referendum with more information, less lies, obviously, and I suppose maybe also a different outcome. So if the outcome had been different, would you also still say it was badly done? Holding you to account here.
Yes, well, fortunately, I have a written record that even before the result, I said it was a terrible referendum.
Fair dues, fair dues.
And that this was a big problem. So
because as a British man living in Germany, I suppose you also have your own personal political interest. But I mean, yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, it's definitely meant a lot more paperwork for me than I would have had otherwise. So I definitely have a personal vendetta in that regard. But that, I mean, for me, this is the two sides of the problem of political inequality, right? Like, there's too much power for the wealthy in our democratic politics, and there's too little engagement from the poor, essentially. And that really is one thing that sort of drives my interest in democratic innovations. So the second problem that's really been preoccupying me lately is more a problem of the policymaking capacity of democracies. We could maybe also link that to Brexit in one sense, right? Like, if you think about the problem of Brexit, what the British policy institutions have done have created a problem that they have no capacity, it seems, to solve. But that was not actually really the issue that I'd been thinking about this most in relation to. It was actually more to do with the climate change issue. I think representative democracies have a real problem with the climate change issue. So far, there's no evidence that our current democratic structures can produce the kinds of laws and policies that we need to address climate change. I mean, what we've basically managed to achieve so far is inadequate promises that we then don't deliver on. It's really difficult to think of a more catastrophic policy failure than when a political community potentially destroys the conditions of its own existence. I mean, how can you fail bigger than that? So I think we have to start thinking about, is this something structural about our democracies that is stopping us from solving this problem and producing the right kinds of policies? I really started to worry about this a few years ago when I attended a presentation by Ian Goehte at the LSE. And he wrote a book that's called Heat, Greed and Human Need. And in this book, he takes something called the minimum income standards. So in the UK, there's basically a deliberative process called the minimum income standards. And this is where a group of ordinary people get together and deliberate what's the sort of bare minimum that people need for an acceptable standard of living. And then they put together a sort of basket of goods. And that's used to think about what the sort of poverty line is. And what Ian Goehte calculated in his book is that the carbon budget for this minimum standard of living is more than 2.5 times higher than the level required to reach the target of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Right, so if we think about what that means, this means that if the whole population of the UK or Germany lived basically just above the poverty line, then we'd still overshoot our carbon reduction targets. Yeah, so what this suggested to me is that without some kind of technological miracle, the defining political economy problem of the next 30 years or so for wealthy democracies will be how can we collectively agree and deliver massive reductions in consumption. And these reductions potentially need to be so large that they challenge what we currently take for granted as a kind of minimum standard of acceptable living. And we need to start making these reductions now, right? Like, it's not like we need to make them in 30 years' time. But can you really imagine a scenario for the next election where there was a political party that ran on that platform and won? I mean, for me, it's completely unimaginable that situation could take place. And I think this is actually says something about our democratic institutions, right? Like, and I think that is that there's a promise of overconsumption built into the way that we do democratic politics or representative democratic politics. And what I mean by that is that basically our politics functions on the assumption that there's no fixed limits on consumption. And that's really what enables the justification of the huge economic inequalities that we find in our societies, right? Like, if you want to have unlimited consumption by the wealthy, then you have to justify that on the basis that it's good for everyone. And the way that we do that is we say that in a capitalist economy, this kind of limitless consumption at the top raises all the boats at the bottom. Consumption levels at the bottom would be lower if we didn't have these high levels of consumption at the top. If we reject this promise that we can have ever-growing consumption, it's really difficult to see how that sort of oligarchic democratic compromise that we talked about a little bit earlier really works. I mean, it would seem to fundamentally rupture. the way our democratic politics functions. And so I feel like we really need new democratic structures in order to facilitate conversations and agreements about how we deliver these kinds of reductions in consumption that we'll need in order to deal with the problem of climate change. And I don't really see much in our democratic institutions at the moment where we're having those kinds of conversations.
But is the problem here really democracy, or do you think it might be capitalism?
I don't think you can really easily separate representative democracy from capitalism, right? Like, this is actually one of the problems of political science. It doesn't think about political economy enough. And so they go together, right? We live in a representative democratic capitalist society, and those capitalism and representative democracy function together to produce certain policy outcomes. So I don't think you can really say, like, this is just a problem of capitalism and not a problem of representative democracy. It's a problem of the way that they work together to produce certain policies and laws.
Talking about climate change, one democratic innovation that's been getting a lot of attention lately in Germany are citizens' assemblies. And you and your colleagues have done quite a lot of research on those. What type of democratic innovation is this?
Citizens' assemblies are essentially a type of deliberative minipublic. As I said before, deliberative minipublics come in various different types, and citizens' assemblies tend to be larger deliberative minipublics, a sort of minimum of 100 people or more. And they tend to take place over a longer period of time. Yeah, they're sort of long duration, larger deliberative mini-publics. And the first Citizens' Assembly was the British Columbia Citizens' Assembly, which took place in 2004. And it actually ran for 10 months. The idea there was that the British Columbia electoral system was producing very strange outcomes where parties were winning majorities and then not getting into government and so on. And so there was a process to think about how to reform the electoral system. But obviously politicians have distinct incentives in which kind of electoral system you want, right? Like, you want the one that favors your party. So the idea was that a citizens' assembly would be a more neutral actor in this debate and could make a decision for the public, like what was the best electoral system for the public good. They were given various different options about different electoral systems, and then they took 10 months to deliberate which one would be the best one, and then they made a recommendation. And then that recommendation was put to a referendum. And after 2004, I would say that these citizens' assemblies continued to happen, but there wasn't exactly an explosion in them. And then we had the Irish Constitutional Commission in 2012 to 2014, which also used a citizens' assembly. So this was a process, right, to think about how to reform the Irish constitution. And this got a lot of attention, partly because it led to referendums on same-sex marriage and also to liberalise abortion laws in Ireland. Ireland is obviously a highly Catholic country, so it was a bit surprising in one way that these referendums then passed, right? Like, the same-sex marriage was legalized and there was a decision to liberalize abortion laws. And since then, there's really been an explosion in these citizens' assemblies, and particularly on climate change. There's been climate change assemblies all over Europe, one in Germany, in France, in the UK, in Scotland, in Austria, Denmark, and there's still plans for many more. And there's been lots happening on all those ones I mentioned are national level ones, but there's also been a lot happening on the local level as well with the commissioning of citizens' assemblies. And Extinction Rebellion have also called for citizens' assemblies as one of their demands on climate change. Essentially, Germany has been no exception to this trend in the expansion of citizens' assemblies. There's been quite a few quite high-profile citizens' assemblies in Germany over the last couple of years. So there was the Bürgerrat Demokratie, which thought about how to reform German democracy on the federal level. There was one on Deutschlands Rolle in der Welt, which at the time seemed a strange question. I don't think anyone was demanding that we talked about Germany's role in the world, but since the Ukraine crisis has seemed actually quite prescient. And then there was another one, as I mentioned, a climate assembly. One of the reasons that these assemblies have spread so quickly is because of the Irish experience, right? Like, the Irish experience has been very, very influential and inspiring. And this is partly because of the context in which it happened. If we think about the way that representative politics has been developing over the last 10 years or so, it's been moving in a right populist direction. And then these citizens' assemblies seem to deliver liberal outcomes, even on highly contested issues like abortion and same-sex marriage. I think lots of people were then quite excited that this was a way that you could get people together on polarized issues to resolve polarized issues.
So what's been the results from your perspective? Do they actually help to resolve those polarized issues?
Well, I feel like that people have drawn the wrong lesson from the Irish experience. I started researching these deliberative minipublics about 15 years ago. So when I say this, I feel a bit like someone who has had their favourite obscure band discovered by the general public and is now like, oh, you like them for all the wrong reasons. I think, that it's difficult to say that the Irish Citizens' Assembly really resolved these issues. I mean, what would it even mean to resolve the debate on abortion? Right?
Or climate change? What would be the result? Is it like the question can't be, does it exist or doesn't it exist, surely?
Yeah. So I think what actually happened in Ireland was essentially that the majority opinion on those issues had already changed. But there was a blockage in the political system which stopped sort of representative institutions updating, right? So because of different electoral incentives and so on, like those issues were seen pretty much as untouchable by politicians. And what this process gave permission to do is basically to update the policies and laws in a way that was now consonant again with majority opinion. But this is a very different thing from resolving a polarized issue, right? Like resolving a polarized issue sounds like you convinced the people who disagreed with you that now gay marriage is okay and abortion is okay. I think this is kind of unlikely. And this is not what we saw in the referendum results, right? It was not like 90% voted for these things. I think it was around about 60-40 or 65-35. So there's still really sizable proportion who don't agree. So the idea that, I think if we have this idea that mini-publics can resolve polarized issues, then this really sets them up to fail, because I think this is a kind of unreasonable expectation. The other thing I would probably say about the question of can they solve these problems is to really question whether we can say something generalizable about a process like a citizens' assembly. Like, can citizens' assemblies achieve this or realize this thing? I mean, because again, this goes back to what I was saying about democratic innovations earlier, that it tends to think about things in terms of institutional design features. And so all citizens' assemblies include this random selection process and this expert evidence, and then this process of citizen deliberation and so on. So it sort of lends itself to thinking about, okay, well, can sortition, so random selection, can deliberation and expert evidence and so on produce this certain effect? And I think this is a bit of a mistake, really, because these internal design features of the process are only one aspect of the process, right? Like, we also have to think about how is this citizens' assembly integrated into other representative institutions and so on. And actually, there's really a lot of variability there. The paper that I've been writing recently with Graham Smith and John Boswell, we've been looking at the 6 national level climate assemblies, which are all quite similar internally. But when you look at the ways that they connect with different political institutions, they're extremely different. So the French one, for instance, was commissioned by President Macron.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So had a direct link to the president. Yeah, whereas the UK one was commissioned by a parliamentary committee to inform its kind of parliamentary scrutiny work. So it wasn't directly from the government, it was from the parliament. This is a very different kind of connection to the political system. And the German one was actually the most interesting from my perspective, because it was the only one that wasn't commissioned by any sort of authorized decision maker. It was actually commissioned by Scientists for Future, which is obviously a civil society group. We would expect these things to have actually very different effects on the sorts of effects that the Citizens' Assembly could have. And we miss these when we only think about them in terms of their internal design features. So I think, like I said, it's very difficult to talk about a sort of generalizable effect of these things. Given that, I still think we can sort of we can have some kind of expectations about what they might do and what they might fail to do. Like I said, resolving polarized issues is not really a reasonable expectation. So if we think about those problems that we talked about before, the sort of oligarchy problem, the climate change problem, the non-participation problem, then I think they have different relations to those problems. And I think that the interesting thing about sortition is that we tend to think about, so there's this really interesting book by Bernard Manin where it's a book of intellectual history, and he sort of really challenges the idea that democracy has always been associated with elections. He basically argues that throughout most of history, democracy was seen as an oligarchic mechanism of decision making, and actually sortition was seen as the democratic mechanism of decision making. And so this is quite interesting in terms of the oligarchic problem, right? I think like one of the interesting things about these citizens' assemblies is through sortition, you can create a space which is not dominated by money and special interests. And that's quite attractive in one way. So people can come together to talk about the public good in a hopefully not such a distorted way. But then you have to, like I said, ask about, well, what then happens to the outputs of that assembly? And we have to say that these advisory assemblies that we've seen, they produce these recommendations, but then, of course, they go back out to our existing representative institutions, our existing public sphere, in which the media and those institutions are dominated by the wealthy. So how much traction are they going to have? I think this is a real big problem that we miss if we don't think about these kinds of connections. I think that also corresponds to the climate change problem, really, because we might partly see the climate change problem as linked to the oligarchy problem, right? Part of the problem of making good climate policy is sort of special interests prevent representative institutions from taking certain positions. But then I think there's a couple of additional issues with the climate change issue. So obviously we get these citizens together in this space in which they have time and expertise and so on to deliberate on. But as I was saying, I think climate change policy probably needs quite radical policy solutions. And I'm not sure we can really expect people to kind of, in such a short period of time, step outside of the usual way we think about these issues, right, and come to a really kind of radical solution. Maybe that could happen. The evidence so far has been that the recommendations of climate assemblies are more radical than the policy status quo, I would say, but not really that radical. And so it's quite interesting. This is potentially like a useful effect. Like you can have this ratcheting effect where we get gradually more and more appropriate policy interventions on climate change.
Right.
But there's also a second problem, which is that it's very difficult to see that a small assembly of, say, 160 people, this was the climate assembly in Germany, if it did come up with very radical propositions, how would it really have the legitimacy to compel people who weren't involved and didn't take that decision to subscribe to those positions? That's also quite difficult to see. I don't think many people would say, okay, this randomly selected body has the legitimacy in that sense. And this is linked to a kind of core idea of sort of political legitimacy and representative democracy, which is that for a decision to be democratic, then we have to give our consent. This is the idea of what elections do. We consent to decisions by electing people who make those decisions. And yeah, because that's missing, and this is such a core part of the way that we think about political legitimacy, it's kind of hard to see how they would ever have that kind of legitimacy to impose solutions on people. So I don't really think that climate assemblies could be a silver bullet, right? Like we could just commission a climate assembly in which it comes up with all of the radical policy solutions that we need, and then they become implemented, and then we solve the problem of climate change. I think there's a couple of other uses for deliberative mini-publics that would pertain to some of these problems that we talked about. One of which I've written about a little bit, but it's been written about much more extensively by John McCormick and Camilla Fagara, is the use of these kinds of processes, random selected citizen processes, for mechanisms of deciding whether politicians have engaged in misconduct or not. Right. So a good example here would be Trump's impeachment, right? Like it's kind of strange when you think about Trump's impeachment that his co-conspirators in his supposed crime were able to judge whether he committed the crime or not. We wouldn't accept this in a normal legal trial. No, and we should probably expect we should probably have higher expectations of our politicians than ordinary people, because they're in positions of authority and responsibility and so on, right? So, but the kinds of mechanisms that we have, I think, in many democracies for disciplining politicians is the idea that politicians should be disciplined by other politicians. And this creates problems when politicians no longer subscribe to the kind of informal norms that had been assumed to guide their action. So this is the case with the Republican Party in the US. It's not really clear that it subscribes to democratic norms anymore. And so then people can get away with anything. It's also been a problem in the UK. There's been many times where someone has been judged by the relevant authorities that they've broken the ministerial code, but this has to be enforced by Boris Johnson. He just doesn't enforce it. So there was actually an example recently where someone was convicted of breaking the ministerial code, and they just essentially tried to change the system rather than enforce it. And there was a big uproar about this, and they eventually backed down. But it's kind of interesting, right? Like, why is Boris Johnson deciding whether his own ministers have committed offences or not. It seems
towards something that's the rules of the game, supposedly.
Yeah, there's an obvious conflict of interest there.
Obviously, yeah, sure.
But it seems like this is a good thing for the public to decide, right? Like the public are actually very well placed to decide whether someone has breached public trust or not.
So this plays to your fourth category or your fourth type of participation, right? The idea of controlling, holding to account through democratic innovations, holding the state or government to account through democratic innovations.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a good form of sort of participation as judgment.
Right.
And so I think like thinking about how we redesign our disciplinary mechanisms in politics is kind of could be a useful place for these sorts of interventions. And then I think even another form of participation as judgment, as I mentioned, was when the state authorities are seen as in some way compromised to make this decision, and so you have to give the decision to someone else. And so this was the example with the British Columbia example that I talked about, right? That here the politicians were seen as having an incentive for a particular electoral system, and so it was better to get someone who wasn't politicians to decide.
So those instances are the vital ones where all of these democratic, especially mini-publics, but also other types of democratic innovations can really make a difference.
Yeah, I think so.
Improving democracy.
When you have these kinds of blockages in the political system, they can maybe act as a catalyst or something to unblock the political system and decide something based on the public interest.
Yeah.
It still takes us back to this same problem of consent. How are they authorized to take this decision and so on? But there are many ways in which we have many institutions in a democracy that take these kinds of public judgments which aren't elected. You know, central banks are a good example of that. No one says that central banks are not able to take well, some people actually do argue that central banks are not legitimate to take decisions on monetary policy and so on. But our democratic institutions do currently work in that way. And it's not clear that this kind of mini-public is less democratically legitimate than something like an agency which decides on standards or something, which is usually appointed people. So
we've talked about different types of crises. We've talked about several political issues that are preoccupying us at the moment and probably will for some time to come, like Brexit, like climate change, and something that's also had a major impact on our collective public life has been the pandemic. And talking about our interview today, you mentioned that you'd started studying with some colleagues or looking at with some colleagues the way in which the pandemic has had an impact on democracy. And because this affects a lot of us, I also want to ask the questions what you were able to find out in that research.
One of the things that I was involved in the early stages of the pandemic was commissioning a special issue of the journal Democratic Theory to look at the ways that the pandemic was affecting democracy around the world. So we invited lots of leading scholars on democracy from all around the world to kind of give us our reflections on what were the implications of the pandemic for democracy. Again, I guess the pandemic and democracy are two very broad terms. So like I said with the effects of citizens' assemblies, it's kind of hard to talk about a general effect of the pandemic on democracy because it had quite different effects on different countries and different democratic systems and so on. And so I mean, that was one of the ideas of sort of this special issue, I guess, was challenging this narrative that the pandemic was leading to autocratization and the erosion of democracy. In some cases, this was definitely true. Hungary, Poland, some Latin American countries.
So-called pandemic power grab. I remember that distinctly. That was being discussed where in some countries, some more autocratic parties or figures rose to power in the midst of the confusion of the pandemic. Right.
Yeah, exactly. I would not say so much that they rose to power. It was more places where there was already an executive that was trying to erode democratic institutions, used the pandemic as cover to further erode those democratic institutions, right? So Orban has been in power for a long time in Hungary, and he used COVID to further his project of eroding the democratic institutions of Hungary. But what we kind of saw, really, was that even in countries where you had these kinds of executives in place who wanted to erode democratic institutions, there was often still space for civil society actors and so on to push back against that. So it was mainly in countries where you had this intention from executive actors to erode democracy and civil society had already been weakened that we saw this further erosion of democracy. But in countries like Germany, we didn't really find any sort of worrying erosions of democratic governance during the pandemic. There's quite different effects in different countries, I would say. I mean, I think the most interesting question that this pandemic raised for democracy is more, not so much was it a cause of democratic erosion or democratic innovation or so on. How do we actually want to do democratic politics in an emergency or in a crisis? And this is going to become increasingly an issue for us with the advance of the climate crisis, right? And Wolfgang Merkel in the special issue wrote an article about this. How exactly do we do sort of emergency politics? And what happened in pretty much all countries around the world was that they very quickly switched in this sort of executive decision-making mode. So the normal processes of parliamentary scrutiny, public consultation and so on were suspended, and governments made decisions by executive decree. This seemed pretty justifiable at the beginning of the pandemic, but the longer the pandemic went on, the more unjustifiable to me this seemed to become, because you can plan, right? Like the pandemic is no longer new. And I think we take our idea of emergency politics really from wartime situations. And then, of course, in a wartime situation, it's very difficult to do transparent politics because you have a foe with intention, right? So you have an enemy who can use that transparency against you. So you have to have some form of secrecy. COVID-19 is not this kind of enemy. And so you can engage in transparent politics. What we want to question is whether we want to govern in these sorts of crises, pandemics, climate events, and so on, in this very untransparent executive politics mode. And I think that's kind of questionable. This mode of decision making also had effects for who benefited and who was really not benefiting from the policies that were made in this time to deal with the pandemic. And really the pandemic itself had unequal effects, right? Like it affected poor communities more than rich communities. It affected people who work in contact with the public much more than people like us, for instance, who it was very stressful. We had to change a lot about our jobs, but we could still do them online. We weren't worried that we were going to get fired and lose our jobs. So that was quite a privilege during the pandemic. So the pandemic was already having these effects on sort of social inequalities, and then the policy-making process often intensified these effects. And I don't think this was bad faith in any way, but it's just because policymakers are a certain type of people. They're not usually poor people, and they don't usually have a good idea of how the world of poor people functions. And so if you remove all the normal processes of pluralist politics from a policy-making process, then this is the kind of policy you'll get. You'll get policies which are very good for people who live in big houses with gardens and so on, but are not so good for people like my sister, who had 3 children in a 2-bedroom apartment with no outside space. I mean, they were stuck indoors for months. And they have a park just outside, but they weren't allowed to go and sit in the park. I think it's very unlikely, if all of our politicians lived in small apartments with no outside space, no private outside space, that we would have had the same policies about public space that we did.
In the UK, that is.
Yeah, this was in the UK, sorry, not in Germany.
No, it's just to clarify, yeah.
And I think there are many things like that, right? The policies were designed in one way for the typical citizen, and then the typical citizen is constructed in a very...
The default was a middle-aged man, usually working in an office job with a nuclear family and a house and a garden, really. I know this was the way it was in the UK when I followed it, but there were aspects of that in the German case as well. So the typical was a presumption, really, which didn't hold true.
I mean, I think we want to think about that more concretely for the future, right? That if we're going to have to govern in crisis mode, then we don't really want to keep producing policies which have these inequality effects. So that for me was one interesting debate, I think, that came out of this. I don't think we have an answer to that, like how exactly politics should function in a crisis, but I think we should be less eager to quickly move into this executive politics mode, which seemed to be pretty much consensus, right? Like everyone did this pretty quickly and there was not very much dissensus. Even in a country like Germany, which is very, very concerned about this kind of untrammeled executive power, all of the parliament basically voted very quickly for this executive politics.
They did, but also I think one of the things that struck me when you just said it is that obviously crisis politics can't be equated with wartime politics. There's going to be different crises than war times impacting society. So I think that's fundamental. So that takes us back to the idea of transparency and legitimacy in democracies.
Yeah, I think another issue that came up beyond the sort of executive issue was also the way that our democratic politics functions on the nation state level, right?
Of course.
This was
the virus knows no borders.
yeah, exactly. So there was a kind of question about whether nation state politics or having all of our structures so nation state politics enables us to deal with these kind of global problems. It's very difficult to achieve zero COVID in one country, for instance, unless you're on an island like New Zealand. Yeah, this is also, I think, an interesting aspect that we would think about for the future is what is the relevant level of policy making for these kinds of crises? And maybe we need structures for better coordination across borders and so on. I mean, obviously the EU did take partly a role, but the EU didn't really have competencies for health policy. And so it was very slow to act. And actually, I mean, one of the really interesting things about the pandemic, right, was that like the constitutional provisions of the EU were quite quickly abandoned, right? Like our rights to free movement and so on were very quickly
just out the window.
Yeah, this was really interesting in this kind of borderless
borders,
place.
Yeah, just like no, actually, we have borders now.
Yeah, so it very much intensified this idea that we really live in national communities, and that the national community is the relevant community for doing politics
In a crisis.
Yeah. And we maybe want to challenge that assumption to some extent.
Especially for questions that concern everybody broadly, which would, again, take us back to climate change.
One other really interesting thing that came out for me from these articles, and it's not something I'd thought about too much before, was how do you produce sort of solidarity in a crisis, right? Like how do you facilitate that people help each other to get through this crisis? And what we saw at the very beginning of the crisis was a lot of this very informal solidarity, right? That neighbours would help neighbours, and there were all of these very inspiring stories of people raising money for charities and so on. There was an interesting article by Barbara Preinsack in this special issue where she talks about the conditions for the production of long-term solidarity, and she basically says like, this is what happens in a crisis always. Like you get this initial wellspring of solidarity, but this really can't be maintained for very long if you don't have institutions which support it, because people basically get exhausted. And so this is also quite interesting for me, because obviously the pandemic hit on the back of sort of a decade of austerity where we have eroded a lot of those sort of institutional bases for production of solidarity. And these kinds of institutions are actually really integral for dealing with things like a pandemic, right? Like people can stay at home to protect others if they have good statutory sick pay. If they don't have statutory sick pay, for instance, then they're much more likely to go to work and keep spreading the disease. I mean, this has been a very big problem in Britain, where sick pay is very, very low compared to the European average. So this, I think, was also a kind of interesting question, both for our kind of economic institutions, right? Like it was quite interesting that there was this wellspring of thought also about reforming economic institutions in a democratic direction in the pandemic. And this was, to me, not surprising, given that now, in some sense, your boss could put you in very risky, in situations that were very risky for your health. When we're starting to make these kind of life or death decisions, the sort of structures by which we organize economic institutions, where you basically have to do what your boss says, we don't have usually a kind of democratic framework for thinking about decision making in the workplace, suddenly became very stark, like that this was in some ways unfair. So it's also beyond the sort of standard political institutions about like, should we be doing parliamentary or executive politics? I think the pandemic sort of stimulated as well some thinking about, well, how do we transform our other institutions as well so that they are more effective in these kinds of situations, and they can generate this kind of long-term solidarity so that we can help each other, and so that we're not put in these kind of risky situations. So I think that was also quite interesting.
A lot of food for thought for all of us. We talked about so much, we covered so many issues in this interview, and I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us about all of them. And I hope that our listeners also gained some insights into what democratic innovations are and how they can contribute to improving our collective life. Obviously, as per usual, our default question for the end of every conversation is, Rikki, you've been in Frankfurt, you mentioned 5 years now. What's your favorite place in Frankfurt, in or outside of university?
So I have to say I've become a bit of a Frankfurt patriot in my 5 years here. I really love it here. So there's many places that I like in Frankfurt. A lot of people on this podcast have mentioned how nice our university campus is, and we're very lucky there. I very much like that we have a very huge number of birds on the campus. There's all of these different woodpeckers and A couple of weeks ago on my journey into work, I rescued a pigeon from an attack by a bird of prey. So this
That was good karma for you, Rikki. Wow.
So this is not really something you expect on your journey into the university. But yeah, I guess you often find me drinking a coffee in Opernplatz. So this is one of my favourite places in Frankfurt. And it's quite a bourgeois space, surrounded by the opera house, expensive cafes and restaurants and so on. You often find like old couples dancing tango on the steps of the opera house. But alongside that, you also have like vegans scribbling slogans on the floor. You have like immigrant communities protesting against human rights abuses in their countries of origin. And then increasingly, I'm noticing you're getting a lot of Instagrammers who come with like bags full of clothes and then like do a fashion shoot in front of the opera house. So yeah, it seems to be like a place where Frankfurt really comes together, right? Like you get lots of different people there. And I think one thing that we often don't think about in terms of democracy is the importance of public space. Public space is really vital for a democracy, like places where people can come and form sort of democratic subjectivities. So I'm going to go with Opernplatz as my favourite place.
I think you win the prize of giving the most social scientist answer to this question. So I was like, I like to have a beer in this place. And you're like, well, we have to think about public space. But yeah, you're right. And thank you for answering that question in such a nice way. And thanks a lot for coming on to talk to us. I hope you enjoyed yourself as we did.
Yeah, it's been really nice. And thanks very much for inviting me. I'm interested to hear what it comes out like in the end.
This was our episode on democratic innovations with Rikki Dean. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. For more information on what we spoke about today, please check our show notes. You can also leave us a comment or drop us a message on social media at TalkSoScience. And if you're interested in collaborating with us, drop us an email. All of the information for our website and sending us messages can also be found in today's show notes. As always, we'd like to thank Radio Dauerwelle for their enduring support, especially on the technical side of things. And we'd also like to thank Freunde und Förderer once again for supporting our project financially. Our next episode will be out next month, as per usual, and we'll be talking about the development of party systems in the 19th century, a project that's been worked on by Dr. Philipp Erbentraut together with his colleagues Vicente Ponsmati and Annika Davis. We will have Vicente in the studio and maybe some more of his colleagues to discuss what they found out in working on this project, and we look forward to having you back as our listeners.